So with all of those thanks, we're going to kick off the speaker by introducing S.E. Nash. So S.E. Nash is a visual artist and fermentation experimentalist, and is also the William T. Kemper Visiting Assistant Professor in Painting at the Kansas City Art Institute, Kansas City, Missouri, where he also teaches in the field of social practice art. A fermentation residency with Sander Katz in 2014 was the impetus for Nash to create sculptures that interact with vessels of fermented foods. Nash has led an active fermentation practice since then and combines his kitchen and gardening practices with his studio practice. He sees these locations as interconnected sites for symbiotic awareness. So today, Nash is going to be leading an interactive talk on the role of fermentation as a catalyst for change, and how he pairs art and fermentation in socially engaged artworks and events. Immediately following his talk, Nash is also going to be selling and signing copies of his artist-produced zine, Fostering the Microcosmos. He will also be signing free copies of the first issue of Fermentation magazine. Yeah, super exciting. So with that, I'm going to hand it off and enjoy the talk.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for being here today. I am really excited to be here. It's been such a great day to taste new things, and just it's almost overwhelming how much awesomeness is here. I live in Kansas City now. I've lived there for 3 years, but before that, I lived in New York City, and the Boston Fermentation Festival was legendary, but it never got to make it up. So I'm really thankful to Jeremy and Heather for asking me to come this year. I'm thankful to you for coming to spend the hour with me to talk about art and fermentation, the exchange between those things, and tasting creativity and community was the parentheses of my talk. So the way that I engage art and social engagement in my work, what inspires me about food fermentation, and how that came to be part of my artistic practice. Before I do any of that, I just want to ask you a few questions to get to know you. So by a show of hands, who is totally new to fermentation? Anyone totally new? There's like maybe. Cool. So how about, well, I mean, maybe you just found out about it and you have, well, what's your example? Like, what do you?
I've done some stuff, but I wouldn't say I was like very proficient.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you're medium. So those of you who've had, obviously, there's expertise in the room, so some experience. Experts in the room, show of hands. You're like. Okay, so I don't know where you all are at with how you relate to fermentation, but I love that you're here and excited about it. I'll be talking a little bit less about the how-to of fermentation in those specific terms, but I will talk a lot about the fermentation as a metaphor. So how I see fermentation, both the practice of it and the exciting sort of metaphorical language and application of it in my work. And along the talk, I'll be asking different questions of you to make the talk interactive. So I would love for you to, feel free to ask questions along the way. We'll have a Q&A at the end, regardless. So for me, I think about how we can use the power of fermentation, the creativity, to spark new ideas. For me, fermentation is like combinatory play, or Einstein's words for opening up a mental channel by dabbling in another. So I realized that all the things I was doing in the kitchen, the fermentation experiments, and science interests that I had in the kitchen, that these things were really related to my studio-based practice, which to that point hadn't included anything living or fermented, and I really wanted to engage socially and have people eat my work. But first I had to learn about fermentation. So I'm going to show you a few things that I ferment most regularly to start off. I started with a sourdough starter in my New York City kitchen. What I was amazed with was how a combination of flour and water could macroscopically reveal that microbes are everywhere, that they're in the air, they're on a flower, they're on our hands, that this, jarred experiment that became a pet that I had to take care of and tend to, and that tending and caring became part of, the reason that I was really compelled to keep going, because it required me and it was fun to watch. It was fun maybe even for it to fail a little bit and get restarted. I don't make a ton of sourdough anymore. I'm making a lot of tempeh these days. I make jun, kombucha, and water kefir regularly. I'm going to always have some vegetable ferment going on. So I'll show you some different examples of that in my work as we go, but those are my regulars. I went to a fermentation residency with Sandor Katz, as was mentioned. This was a really, really pivotal moment for me in my discovery of fermentation, because I had had a job in New York City that I was kind of sick of. I wanted to change. I found fermentation with that sourdough starter, and I really felt like I needed to pivot my whole world into something new in order to change my art and to kind of make it alive. Fermentation being that, it's so much about seeing living things and being excited by, for me, the microbial world. I just had to quit that job and go to this 3-week residency in Tennessee with Sandor Katz. There were about 12 other residents there, and I'm from Tennessee, so going back to Tennessee at that time was actually really important for me. I'm queer. I grew up growing up in Tennessee, it was not necessarily the most friendly place to be, but I found through Sandor's residency, it exists in a nexus of queer communities. There's queer intentional communities all around. So it was actually this really great place to go discover some connections that I started to develop, and I'll talk about a little bit later, regarding identity for me and social context of how fermenting with a bunch of other people around the kitchen table and sharing those things together actually led to a lot of other important discoveries about how we feel about fermentation, what it does for us, how it empowers us. I wanted to bring that energy to the work I was making. So I used the residency as a way to think about my work. Traditional artist residencies, you're going and you're making your work during that time. So this was different because I was learning basically everything from his books, The Wild Fermentation and The Art of Fermentation. Anything we wanted to make, he was game for. And it became, for me, a way to think about how do I include this in my artistic practice. So my puzzle, which I'm always seeking puzzles. I always want to figure out, and fermentation is quite a puzzle, is it going to work, isn't it? You have to try again and try again. And so having that kind of resilience with fermentation as a medium and then art making was a kind of natural fit, I think. So I thought about ways to include fermented food that would allow them to be, to remain edible. That was really important, that the food remain edible. So I wanted to make sculptures that would house the fermented foods in a scenario where you could come back and eat them. The sculptures themselves, so that the food could be viewed over time, and since fermentation is a slow process, you might go to the gallery and look at it and see it change and come back and see it again, and then come back for the programming. But the visual aspects of the sculptures, I wanted to reflect my fascination with the microbial world. So I've been doing some microscopy. My wife bought me a relatively inexpensive microscope, and I started looking at culture under the microscope. And I was just fascinated that this tiny slice of life in between a glass cover sheet, and a glass slide could be this whole dimensional world. That's nothing new to scientists, but of course, I think it can still present a really great new idea of possibility that puts us in perspective. So I like to use an aesthetic in some of the sculptures that gets at this place where microbial life began. Some of the kind of crustiness or the kind of bodily aspects of it. So with that show, I wanted to make sure that I was including a workshop or public engagement. So the sculptures begin with maybe here's a kimchi demonstration, and then from the kimchi demonstration, it goes into the sculpture. The sculpture is called Leuconostoc mesenteroides, which is the bacteria that kind of is dominant in kimchi at the beginning. Then after the fermentation period, at the close of this particular show, we ate the ferments. Really important part of that. So for me, the collective activity of microbes, the wildness, the thing that I experienced around the table with other people, gave me perspective on knowledge, on how we all, as practitioners in whatever way we are, can learn from each other. So I like to always include practitioners of fermentation in the shows. This was a shelf. It was called a collaborative shelf of ferments, where I had anybody from New York City fermentation community come bring jars of fermenting stuff. So we ate those at the end. Could be non-artists, whatever. What I like about that is sort of taking the expert out of it. You don't need a degree to have embodied knowledge, right? You don't need to be called a scientist. You don't need to be called a chef. This intergenerational knowledge, and what I think excites us about fermentation as a revival, is that it seems to come from somewhere that is our and it is ancestral, right? So to learn from each other and share collective knowledge is a really important part of that, not necessarily relying on being the expert in the room. So to that point, I don't have to be the expert. I want to ask you, we're going to create a word cloud. If you're willing to participate and get out your phone and text to this number what your favorite fermented food is. I know it's hard to pick one, so hopefully in a minute we'll get this cloud of things. I'd love to see what, if there's a lot of overlap between what you like, or if or if everything is different. Kimchi, awesome. I love kimchi. What kind of kimchi?
Cucumber.
We talked about so. Cucumber kimchi, another kimchi. Awesome. Kimchi. So cucumber kimchi. Just cucumber?
Yeah. I mean, I like the cucumber. I like it classic. Can't really go wrong. There's capulli, which is radish based.
Yes. Awesome. Anything with koji. A rhubarb kimchi. That sounds amazing. I've never had that. Chocolate, of course. Beer. I was trying to think earlier if beer would be mine, just because I probably consume more of that than any other fermented food. Miso soup. We're doing a survey, so welcome. If you want to text your favorite fermented food, feel free. Floral kombucha, miso, kombucha, sour beer. Love sour beer. I sold beer when I graduated from art school. I worked in beer for a little bit, and sours, although it took a minute, were my absolute favorite. What else do we have? Dosa. Oh. Okay, hopefully you can get a picture of this. All right, we'll let those, well, I guess they can't keep coming in. Cheese, awesome. Curds. Thank you for your participation. I appreciate it. We'll see if we can get a screenshot of that. Does anybody want to share anything about the food that they texted in?
Sour beer.
Sour beer is yours. What kind do you like the most?
I'm kind of on a quest for, like, I never try the same thing twice, you know. Like, I'm always on a quest for the stranger the better, so, you know, especially if it kind of makes them go, what the
Yeah.
is that? Then I'm like, oh yeah, then I love it. But, yeah.
Yeah.
Angry sour monkey is a classic.
Yes.
And, Duchess of Burgos.
Oh, the Duchess.
Yep, that's what I got him into, so.
Yeah.
Every time we go out, it's just let's get weird.
Yeah, Fermented is definitely one of my favorites. Okay, this is great, and hopefully you're still hungry because you've been hungry all day. Okay, I will move on from there. And so to talk a little bit more about the, they did it for me. To talk a little bit more about the metaphorical aspects and where I've taken these ideas about fermentation. This show was titled They, Them, Their. So in reference to the gender non-conforming pronouns that are more familiar now even than they were in 2014, I used those pronouns at the time of transgender, and now I use he, him, but my feeling about them translated into the work in the relationship between understanding the context of our microbiome, understanding that we are at least 50 to 80% microbe. There were some much larger estimates, but the consensus is now that it's about half or more. In any case, if we are more microbial cells than human cells, we are multitudes. We are a they, them, and their, in essence. So I think to shift the language, it gives us a place to think about breaking open that binary and thinking beyond what a human is. How can we create new ideas about what it means to be human, what it means to be human in the context of climate change, of a world that we need to repair, and how does part of that reparation in our world have a lot to do with the way we look at and treat each other. So understanding perhaps gender from this perspective that if we know that microbes are playing a role in so many other aspects of our lives and health, it's not that they're on the face of how we choose to dress, but it could impact how we look at and see each other. The microbiologist Betsy Dexter Dyer wrote in her field guide to microbiology that she likes to think with a bacteriocentric perspective. So as much as possible, how can we think how it would be to be incredibly, incredibly small rather than multicellular and large? Can that perspective shift change the way that we relate to the world and look at objects and things? And part of what I want to do with the objects and the sculptures is have this dialogue between something that's living and non-living. What happens if we think about the context of a living fermented food in a sculpture? And does that make us actually think about objects differently? And talking a little more about objects, I forgot to pass this around, which I wanted to have you touch. This is a kombucha SCOBY that's been dehydrated. Some of you might know that people make kombucha fruit leathers. Do you do it?
I haven't done it, but I've seen a whole lot of stuff about how they're trying to make vegan leather out of it.
Yeah, and mycelial leather too. Well, I just wanted you to feel it. It's true, it could make a shirt. They haven't quite figured out how to not make it hygroscopic. That's some nanoparticles that need to happen, but I use it as an art material, so it certainly can be used. It's basically cellulose that just smells a little like vinegar, because what's left is cellulose. So a lot of this context for what's the relationship between feminism and fermentation, or queer perspectives on fermentation. After I went to the residency, I co-authored an article called Bubbling Bodies and Queer Microbes with a food studies scholar named Stephanie Maroney. She and I went to the residency together and reflected on our time there in terms of the relationship of what we felt in that community and how we could see it as a kind of opening for some exciting relationships between thinking about feminism and fermentation. So embodied knowledge, intergenerational knowledge, DIY activity, a lot of these self-care, these things have become important intersections in an academic sense for fermentation by fermentation practitioners. When I moved to Kansas City, I wanted to have a show about sourdough starters. I wanted to collect all the sourdough starters that I could in Kansas City and maintain them in a series of sculptures in that show. So I went on the radio and social media and tried to get as much participation as possible. And I put the sourdough starters in this series of sculptures where I went and fed them every Saturday. You could smell the sourdough starters in the table of starters. They smelled awesome because I was feeding them every Saturday. If I hadn't done that, they would have stunk, frankly. Because you know how it gets. It can get moldy. But what was fascinating was how different they smelled. I asked each person to also contribute a narrative, just a story about their starter, knowing that the something like sourdough starters or starter cultures in general, if they're handed down, that narrative is so important to the life, I think, of why we feel connected to certain foods. So even if some of it's fabricated, it doesn't matter because that's the fun part. So at the end of that show, I asked everyone to come and bring sourdough baked goods. So it was tasty, and there were a lot of really different, exciting foods at that. I made sourdough English muffins, and they were better than I expected. Okay, we're at another point to ask you more questions. So talking a little bit about the metaphorical use of fermentation, if there's one adjective that comes to mind, be as creative as you like. When you think about fermented foods, what's your favorite descriptor or just some way that you connect with it? I'm not going to say any because I'm sure you're going to cover it. Yeah, yummy and funky, humbling. I want to hear more about that. Does a person want to say anything about humbling?
I read humbling.
Okay.
And I don't actually, I personally have done that one, but my mom does it quite a bit. And it's just whenever she's talking about the conditions, the temperature of a house and the things that you have to have on hand to make your kefir and stuff in the morning, and it's just very it always reminds you on a daily basis there's so many things that you're not paying attention to that actually have a huge impact that you really should be paying attention to. And that's, I don't know.
That's awesome. Yeah, so it's a sensitive, or there's
it makes you more sensitive because when you're making
emotional connection.
Yeah, when you're making fermented food, you're naturally more sensitive to all the things that you want more.
Very cool. Grounding and earthy, tart, juicy, generative, fertile, mysterious, alive and well, absolutely healthy, evolving and experimental. Of course, experimental is one of my favorite parts about it, and my favorite part is DIY fermentation, because when you're making things yourself and you're getting away from necessarily, of course, support all the producers of fermentation, but making it yourself can teach you a lot about our relationship to food. I'm going to have them change it. That's really great. Thanks for doing that. So I'll share a few more projects. This is garden variety soda fountain. It received a Rocket Grant Research and Development Award. So I got this R&D grant to basically grow in the garden for the first time. I'd never done that. When I got to Kansas City, I was really excited to grow stuff. I had land, I had access to a community garden. So I wanted to do a project that would be exhibited in the garden and let people have stuff for free. So the grant allowed me to create about 12-ish sodas. That was a lot for me. There we go. That came out of the orchards and what I was growing. So I made pickle water kefir, sour cherry kombucha, blackberry Joner kombucha, basil kefir, like a basil tea in the water kefir, pineapple jalapeno kombucha, and elderberry kombucha. And they were all totally delicious. You know, I had to pick the cherries like 3 months in advance and then make a syrup out of that and then save the syrup, which actually turned into its own soda in the fridge on its own, and it was like the best cherry soda I'd ever tasted. And then I combined that with kombucha to kind of extend it. Anyway, delicious soda flavors. So I wanted people to experience these sodas in the garden, you know, understand the sort of time that each thing takes by sipping the soda in like super hot garden, but identifying and walking around the plants and sort of making a more of a connection between where things come from, what the labor involved is, who's involved, and of course all the community gardeners that I work with and take care of the orchards came out. It was a fun neighborhood activity. The cart itself is, everything's kind of a tribute typically to some fermented food. So the cart itself has tiles that are you know, blackberries and cherries, so in tribute to the ingredients that were used in those sodas. I now would like to invite you to participate in something coming up in November. I have a show at Brandeis at the Women's Studies Research Center at the Knisset Gallery. It's called Crowdsourcing. At Crowdsourcing, I am asking for, I'm making a new body of sculptures, mostly based on cabbage and brassicas. I'm asking for everybody who makes sauerkraut of any kind to bring a pint jar, or however much you like, of sauerkraut to that show on the opening night. I'm going to combine it in like a performance lecture scenario, and we're going to eat this big collective kraut together and look at the work and have fun. So if you're able to come out to that, or if you are interested in that, well, here's a recipe, actually. So if you, I know all of you make kraut like all the time, because you're all experts, but anyway, if you haven't made kraut before, I have a recipe in here, in the zine, but it's also on my website. So if you, oh, well, if you want, that's okay. If you want more information about the show and you want to be on the emailing list, I either have like an email sign up that you can come and give me your email, or you can text to this number and you'll get one last text that links to the show. So I would love for you to, you know, be a participant in that. It would be really fun to see you all there. Last, you know, I'll be signing, if you want me to sign it, Fermentation magazine, where I have an article on me on page 12. And this is the first issue of that. These are free, and then I'll have my zine out there. In reference to crowdsourcing, and in spirit of that, I have these samples from Hosta Hill. Following our Q&A, you can pick up kraut samples and try that. So I think at this point we can do a Q&A. Have time for questions. Probably had a lot I didn't answer.
What medium do you usually use for your sculptures?
I use mixed media of all sorts. So I use like a compound resin with fiberglass. I use this stuff called sculpture mold. You know, I'm trying. Well, I use a bunch of different mediums. I mean, you know, some air dry clay, and I actually really like to source materials from what's around me. So I also use like discarded garden stuff and like garden stakes, and you know, just various mixed media stuff that comes up. I mean, I teach in painting, so it's very much tied to like practicing painting as well. So I paint acrylics. Yeah.
What's the yummiest thing you've ever made?
Oh, that's hard. You know, I think I find tempeh so yummy that's why I try to make it pretty frequently. I think the like nuttiness and like sometimes cheesiness and earthiness of like fresh tempeh that's one of my favorites. I also really liked that cherry soda that I made. It was just wild. What's the favorite thing you've made? Have you made anything that would be your favorite?
Today we made kraut outside.
Yeah, today you made kraut outside. So you'll see how that is later. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't going to ask this, but now I want to know what kind of tempeh, what mixture of bean and grain or bean alone.
I typically do just a one legume. I'll do chickpea or I'll do just black bean. I had an event with Sandra Katz at a museum in Kansas City where we did a dinner and I made like tempeh for 60 people, which is also like a lot for me. There was a chef, but I provided the tempeh, and that was just black bean and a chickpea. Not black bean, black eyed pea, and that was my favorite. Actually, I try to go ones with a lot of protein, so I can get a lot of protein out of that instead of eating animal protein.
A big part of a lot of your work seems to be the consumption aspect at the end of it. So I'm just curious if you could speak a bit more about the importance of that sort of collective consumption in the creation process.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it became an important part of it because actually, you know, at gallery openings, since that was my world most of the time, like people want to eat the food, but they don't necessarily talk about the art. So it was like, oh, well, if they eat the food, they're eating the art, and then you're like necessarily talking about the art. So it actually gives people a really easy way to talk about what the art is by just saying that they have some feeling about the thing they're tasting. So part of it was that kind of approachability, that accessibility, because then it kind of opens the door to maybe more questions. Just a way to talk about even some abstract things that are sort of hard to talk about otherwise, and especially in like, raucous social setting or whatever it is. So it gives you a way to kind of say, oh yeah, we are here for the art. Yeah.
So people touch this, is it a touch thing too?
They don't normally touch the sculptures, but
well, they touch it by tasting.
They touch by tasting it. Yeah, and I'll have people like definitely interact with the process.
I was thinking about the somatic aspect of your work.
Yeah.
Like that then they get to they make taste is a great access for everybody to the somatic, because then they can get into what they're feeling. They may not express it, but they're feeling something.
Precisely. Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Or whoever.
I was going to kind of ask about, do you ever play around with, in your art, like the idea of healing and food? And so, like, I make fermented because I think they're delicious, but my mom, who's had serious stomach issues, loves my kimchi, and she says this makes me can you please bring me more kimchi, because it's just part of her diet now. And so do you ever talk about that in your artwork, like the healing aspect?
Yeah, well, sort of. Actually, this show crowdsourcing has a bit more to do with that than anything else that I've done, in the sense that it's kind of about the experience of being transgender and like thinking about gender, especially from that perspective of like, I started to transition at the same time that I was, learning about fermented food and using it, and I see a sort of great opening and connection between like what I started to discover about food and my body, and it opened up this channel for me to learn about my body in ways that I really hadn't been in touch with. And so I see them as like parallel tracks for me, and so personal. This is just in a personal sense. That's how I've been relating to it, and think about that entering the artwork in that context. So just a personal reflection on how fermentation makes me feel connected to my body and healthier in that larger sense of the term.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In my own experience fermenting stuff, I guess one of the most interesting elements is when things kind of go somewhere you weren't expecting. Have you ever had anything that just totally did not like go in the direction you were expecting it to?
Yes, for sure. I think it's going to be hard for me to think of what that is on the spot, because sometimes that I just keep returning to the cherry soda because I didn't know it was going to ferment into a soda, and my plan was for it to ferment later, but it just decided to ferment then. Certainly, there's been, I can think off the top of my head flavors that didn't work out, somewhat more times that I added too much salt, and that's always a bummer, I think, for me. I try to keep a fermentation journal so that I make sure when I'm doing new things, I'm writing down pretty much everything I'd like to record about that ferment, so I'm a little more scientific about it in terms of how to know how to repeat what I've done. Are there any? Yeah.
I wrote down that I think fermenting is beautiful, and I think that there's so much in nature that is so profoundly beautiful. And that piece in the beginning that looked like a big piece of tempeh, kind of close up. I don't know what it was, but it looked beautiful and made me think of the glass flowers at the Peabody Museum. I don't know if you've ever been there.
I'm gonna go.
But that's how they used, how they learned the biology of flowers, and they, blew them up and they made them out of glass. And if you look at the slicing of the, biology of a flower, it looks a lot like the cells of the microbes, and it's the most beautiful experience of nature that we can't see between one flower and another. It's a whole world, and I just feel like it's the same thing with your art and the, looking into the organic nature of it all.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, of course, I love that, and I think, as an artist, how can I get closer to that relationship of making something that's feels like something new? But in my travels, I love to try to see things from that perspective and just always be fascinated, right? And so to have that that landscape of beauty and how microbes, for me, show me that. Well, is that the conclusion? Yeah.
I have a really odd question. So my mother's Korean, so I used to do kimchi at home, but now I live in this very drafty place that does not retain heat. Have you had any experience with fermenting with a place like that where you deal with really cold winters and then the house is cold and things like that? Do you know anything that recipes that I can adapt to or something like that?
I mean, when you try it, does it work after a while?
I tried it once, but then we had a cold snap. Then
I mean, typically when it's colder, it's just going to be a lot slower. It's going to still happen. If your house is 60 something, or I'm just imagining what's cold inside, but it's just going to happen slower. So if you wanted it to happen faster, you could find a smaller space and use a space heater, with a temperature regulator or something like that, or you could just use a heating mat. So those electric seedling mats, you could put it on that. Or you could put my kombucha. I always put that around it in the winter, just because I want it to go at a sort of normal pace. So it adds about 10 degrees to put a little electric heating mat around it, something like that. Yeah. Very, very last questions.
Do you reuse your sculptures in other shows, or usually it's just a one?
Yeah. I reuse them, and because they're just sculptural materials, so they just get restarted by adding more ferments. It's tricky because if it goes into a gallery, I have to be aware of what the conditions are, whether somebody's gonna take care of it, or whether I kind of have to plan for them not taking care of it, how that's gonna go. Either either politically or administratively or whatever.
I have issues with galleries sometimes where they're like, we don't want any like weird food or like liquid in their
Yeah,
space.
yeah. So yeah, it's a negotiation.
Yeah.